Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to this session of Meezan lecture series. As you all know, this lecture series is basically an explanation of Ustaz Javed and Ghamid's book Meezan, which actually is his understanding of the contents of Islam. So, because of the fact that the book was written in the Urdu language, this series is an attempt to explain his view in the English language for the benefit of the English audience. We have been studying various chapters of this book. The chapter which is under discussion relates to the penal law, which means the Islamic punishments prescribed by the Quran. We have discussed some of the punishments at length. Before I go ahead with today's session, let me just put the whole session in perspective. So the first thing that has to be understood is that as far as the penal law of Islam is concerned, as far as the directives are concerned, all of them relate to the state. So none of these directives have any individual import, so to speak. In other words, Islamic punishments have to be administered in all circumstances by state authorities. No person can take the law in his or her hands and administer these punishments. Just as the war or jihad is something which relates to the state authorities, similarly, these punishments also relate to state authorities. The second important thing, which is also noteworthy, is that these punishments are primarily, or we can say, they are meant for Muslims only. Because these punishments are not only punishment for the crime that has been committed, but at the same time, they are punishments for violating the covenant in which a person enters when he becomes a Muslim. And that is precisely why these punishments are very severe. So therefore, we have to understand that as far as these punishments are concerned, they are primarily meant for Muslims. And as far as the crimes are concerned, in which non-Muslims are involved, so on all such instances, the basis of agreement which has been made with them will be invoked, and then these punishments will be legislated. So as the third important thing which we have to understand as far as these penal directives are concerned, that Islam has punished or given these punishments for just 5 crimes. So basically 5 crimes are the ones for which Islam has prescribed punishments and has left the punishment of all other crimes except polytheism, apostasy, and disbelief. These are the 3 exceptional punishments which God says that people who are guilty of polytheism, people who are guilty of disbelief or kufr, polytheism of course is shirk, and people who are guilty of apostasy. These are the punishments which God says that He only has the prerogative to give. He gave them in the times of His messengers, and they gave them on His behalf, and He'll give them in the hereafter. But in the post-prophetic era, these punishments are not applicable. But the ones that are applicable are basically of 5 crimes. So one of them is creating a law and order situation, creating nuisance and anarchy in the land, which is called muharba or fasad fil ard. So this is one crime for which punishments have been prescribed. The second is murder, which of course includes intentional and unintentional murder. We have already studied the directives of intentional murder in our previous session, and today we'll study the directives of unintentional murder. Then we have the punishment. The third punishment is of fornication. The fourth punishment relates to qazf, which also is basically accusing someone of fornication. And the fifth and final punishment is that of theft. So except these 5 punishments, all other crimes for which a person is guilty of, they can be legislated. And the exception is that the death penalty or the death punishment or the capital punishment can only be given in 2 instances. One, if a person murders the other person. And second, if he is guilty of anarchy and disorder, spreading of anarchy and disorder in the land. Other than that, there is no other crime for which the death penalty can be given. So with this background, we have to understand that as far as the Quran is concerned, this is all vis-a-vis the punishments it has prescribed. So neither has it prescribed any punishment for polytheism, apostasy, and disbelief for common Muslims. These were prescribed by God for certain criminals in the era of God's messengers. and he is going to administer these punishments again in the hereafter. And the second important thing is that there are certain other punishments which have been made part of the Islamic Penal Code, which of course are not sanctioned by the Islamic Penal Code. One example of that is the jail punishment, because primarily jail punishment is a punishment in which what we do is we just don't punish the criminal himself or herself. It is the family who suffers, and there are other very important and serious reservations also about the jail punishment, and that is precisely why in the times of the Prophet this was never given. It is a much later introduction in the Islamic Penal Code, and it is something which is more barbarous than many other punishments. So therefore this has been left out of the Islamic Penal Code by the Almighty Himself. Now, connecting our talk and our session back to the previous session. So in our previous session, we had started off to discuss the punishment of murder, and we had completed the punishments of intentional murder, because we all know that murder is of two types. One is that you have the intent to kill someone, and the second type of murder is unintentional. Something happens without intent. So today we will be taking up the punishments of unintentional murder and see how they have been described in the Quran, and later on, if time permits, we'll also take up the punishment of fornication. So now let us turn to the Quran and see how this punishment has been prescribed in the text of the Quran. And if we look at the text of the Quran, this is basically Surah number 4, Surah Nisa, and verse 92, in which this punishment has been set out. I'm just going to read the text in translation. It says, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ أَنْ يَقْتُلَ مُؤْمِنًا إِلَّا خَطَأً وَمَنْ قَتَلَ مُؤْمِنًا خَطَأً فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ وَدِيَّةٌ مُسَلَّمَةٌ إِلَى أَهْلِهِ إِلَّا أَنْ يَصَّدَّقُوا فَإِنْ كَانَ مِنْ قَوْمٍ عَدُوٍّ لَكُمْ وَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ وَإِنْ كَانَ مِنْ قَوْمٍ بَيْنَكُمْ وَبَيْنَهُمْ مِيثَاقٌ فَدِيَّةٌ مُسَلَّمَةٌ إِلَى أَهْلِهِ وَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ فَصِيَامُ شَهْرَيْنِ مُتَتَابِعَيْنِ توبة من الله وكان الله عليما حكيما. And it is unlawful for a believer to kill a believer except if it happens by accident. And he who kills a believer accidentally must free one Muslim slave and pay diyat to the heirs of the victim, except if they forgive him. If the victim is a Muslim belonging to a people at enmity with you, the freeing of a Muslim slave is enough. But if the victim belongs to an ally, diyat shall have to be given to his heirs, and a Muslim slave shall also have to be set free. He who does not have a slave must fast 2 consecutive months. This is from Allah, a way to repent from this sin, and He is wise, all-knowing. So viewers, described in this verse is the punishment of unintentional murder, in which you don't have any intent, and of course you accidentally end up killing someone. And we see that the various clauses in which this law can be divided are basically 3. And Ustaz Ghamidi has laid them out one by one. I'm just going to read them the way he has described them. So, firstly, if the murdered person is a Muslim citizen of his country, or if he is not a Muslim but belongs to a nation with which a treaty has been concluded, it is necessary for the murderer who has not been forgiven to pay diyat to atone for his sin and repent before the Almighty and free a Muslim slave as well. So the first thing that we have to understand here is, I've discussed some of this part earlier also when we were discussing intentional murder, that diyat primarily is a penalty which is imposed on the person who is guilty of murder if he is forgiven. And in the case of unintentional murder, if he is forgiven, then as has been said here, that if a person has not been forgiven and that person is a Muslim citizen of his country, or if he is not a Muslim but he belongs to a nation with which a treaty has been concluded. So any of these cases, if this is the case, and if the murderer has not been forgiven, then in such a situation he will have to pay diyat and also repent before the Almighty, which is a given, and free a Muslim slave. As far as diyat is concerned, we've discussed this earlier on, that this primarily is a penalty. And the Quran says that diyatun musallamatun ila ahlihi, and the words which the Quran uses are that the person who is to be forgiven if he has been forgiven, then the way that diyat would be paid is fattiba'un bil ma'ruf, that the convention of the society will be followed in this regard, which means that the diyat of a person has not been prescribed by the Sharia in any way. It has been left to the custom of a society. This custom can change, it can be different in different countries in the same period of time. But as far as legislation is concerned, in the absence of any custom, even a parliament can come forward and legislate the amount of diyat. But it shall be based on the custom or tradition of the society. In the times of the Prophet, in fact, in his before his time arrived, the diyat was set at 100 camels, and it was the Arab tradition that he followed. So later on, people can adhere to this custom, they can change it, and they can legislate afresh in case of this diyat. But one thing is absolutely certain, that this diyat has not been prescribed in any way by the Quran. The Quran has left this matter to the custom of the society, the conventions of a society, which means the ma'ruf, and that can change from time to time, from society to society. So today, as I said, if there is no ma'ruf, if there is no convention which exists in favor of diyat, then the parliament of a country can legislate this amount. So this is one thing that has to be understood. The second thing is that in such a case, that if a murdered person is a Muslim citizen, and he may not be a Muslim but belongs to a nation with which there has been a treaty, then in such a case, the Quran says, if the murderer has not been forgiven, then diyat has to be paid, and a Muslim slave has also to be set free. So slavery, we all know, was something which was part of the pre-Islamic Arab society, and Islam inherited this institution of slavery. In fact, it set about to emancipate slaves because of the fact that these slaves and their slavery was deeply rooted in the Arab society as a custom. So an immediate order of setting all slaves free was not given. It was done in a gradual way. Today, of course, it has been totally eradicated. So in place of that, our jurists have given this excellent ishtihad to us, that if a person who is in the form, he needs to pay some penalty maybe, or he needs a bail to set himself free. So we can analogously regard such people to be done in lieu of setting for slave free. So this is the first statute as far as the statutes or the law of unintentional murder is concerned. The second one is that if the murdered person is a Muslim and belongs to an enemy country, if the murdered person is a Muslim and belongs to an enemy country, the murderer is not required to pay diyat. In this case, it is enough that he only free a Muslim slave. So what has happened here is that the slave has to be still set free if the murdered person belongs to an enemy country and he is also a Muslim. Now, the third is, in both these cases, if the criminal does not have a slave, he should consecutively fast for 2 months. So this has also been mentioned, that in the absence of having a slave, then the person who is guilty of murder, he must fast 2 consecutive months, which is 60 days of fasting. So this is, or in case we know that these are the 3 statutes on which the law of unintentional murder has been based. As I said, unintentional murder does not mean that we are in any way charged with this murder if it is not our fault at all, and that would not be counted as unintentional murder. For example, if you are driving the car carefully and a person himself throws himself before the car or the vehicle which is moving, then this cannot be regarded as unintentional murder, because it was not done with any intent or lack of intent in this case by the person who was driving the car. That person appeared out of nowhere and he just rammed himself. Maybe he was trying to do suicide, or he might have been wrongly assessing to cross the road. So in such a case, the assessment must be done very fairly, that there has to be some form of accident on the part of the person who is guilty. That has to be understood. In the absence of that, we will not say that any unintentional murder has taken place. So, and also, as we have also seen, that the Quran tells us that these directives, of course, pertain to unintentional murder, but it is obvious that the directive of unintentionally wounding someone, because you are not always end up killing someone accidentally, it can also be possible that you injure someone. So that would be no different. So in this case, diyat shall have to be paid and fast shall have to be kept considering the amount of diyat paid. For example, if the diyat of a certain type of wound is fixed at, let's say, one third of the diyat of the murder, one third of the amount of the diyat of the murder, then one third of 60 is 20, so 20 fasts as atonement shall have to be kept. So this is just to give an idea of the fact that at times it's equally important to realize that you are not killing someone, you have not killed someone, but you have wounded and injured someone unintentionally. So unintentionally injuring and wounding someone also has this penalty. Also important in these directives of intentional and unintentional murder, as I've already said, is that the word diyat must be understood. I mean, in Surah Nisa, we know that the words used are diyatum musallamatun ila ahlihi, and the word diyat has occurred as a common noun. So, as already explained, if there was a very prescribed amount of diyat, the way the diyat has been mentioned here will not be in the form of a common noun. So, it is basically it occurs as a common noun because, as I said, its customary usage has to be trusted. So, nothing other than this is required. So, anything which means custom, I mean, in our custom means diyat will be implied by this. In verse 178 of Surah Baqarah, we studied this earlier on. We know that the words were that فَمَنْ أُوفِيَ لَهُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ شَيْءٌ فَاتِّبَاعٌ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, which means that if there has been some remission from the brother, then this remission has to be followed according to the ma'ruf. فَاتِّبَاعٌ بِالْمَعْرُوف. So this clearly tells us that it is the ma'ruf that has to be followed, which I just explained. Now, we also must understand that as far as these verses of Surah Nisa and Surah Nisa and Surah Baqarah are concerned, in the case of intentional and unintentional murder, the Quran has stipulated this, that the traditions of the society have to be honored. So, in this regard, we cannot discriminate between a man or a woman, or a slave or a free man, or a Muslim or a non-Muslim. So this is something which is unimaginable. The Prophet decided all the cases of diyat according to the customs and traditions of the Arabian society during his own times. And in his own times, we know that there was this tradition of aqila, or the custom of aqila. Aqila would refer to a tribe who would be responsible for any such penalty that was to be given for a crime perpetrated by the member of that tribe. So basically, it was on behalf of that aqila that this would be done. But we know that today this tribal system has it no longer exists. Social conditions and cultural traditions, they have all changed so much, and therefore we have to understand that the nature of aqila, which is community or tribe, has totally changed, and we cannot legislate on the basis of aqila which existed in the times of the Prophet. So in this regard, we have to follow the custom or the maruf, as the Quran has said. And every society is to obey its custom, and because in our own society, for example, in our own Pakistani society, no law exists about diyat previously. I mean, it's something that has to be legislated. So people who are at the helm of the affairs, they can re-legislate. So they don't have to follow the Arab custom of 100 camels, which was the time in the times of the Prophet. So it would be wrong to do so unless, of course, that is willingly adopted, considering it to be the maruf of today's society. But considering it to be the maruf of the Prophet's society and thinking that it is essential to follow his maruf, that would be an erroneous conclusion. So we must keep this in mind, that as far as this is concerned, it has to be based on the maruf or the custom of our own society. Viewers, now let's move on to the third punishment, which has been mentioned in the Quran. I'm just going to read out the text of that punishment also. So we are going to discuss the punishment of fornication. So fornication and adultery, both of course are terms used in the English language. Fornication implies this in which out of wedlock relations take place between two unmarried people, and adultery implies that one of them is married or at times both of them. So we are not making any distinction here when we are describing this punishment. So regardless of the state of the criminal who perpetrates this crime, whether he is married or not married, because this is something which the Quran is not in any way distinguished. So we will discuss this punishment. So let me first read out the text of this punishment before you. This is mentioned in Surah Nur, which is the 24th Surah of the Quran, verses 2 and 3. So the words are: Az-zaniyatu waz-zani fajlidu kulla wahidin minhuma mi'ata jalda wala ta'khuz ولا تأخذكم بهما رأفة في دين الله إن كنتم تؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر وليشهد عذابهما طائفة من المؤمنين الزاني لا ينكح إلا زانية أو مشركة والزانية لا ينكحها إلا زان أو مشرك وحرم ذلك على المؤمنين. The man and the woman guilty of fornication, flog each of them with 100 stripes, and let not compassion move you in their case in the enforcement of the law of God, if you truly believe in God and the last day, and let a party of the believers witness their punishment. The man guilty of fornication may only marry a woman similarly guilty, or an idolatress, and the woman guilty of fornication may only marry such a man or an idolater. The believers are forbidden such marriages. So, in a nutshell, we can see that as far as the Quran is concerned, it has clearly said that in this regard, we have to understand that people who are guilty of this heinous crime, they have to be punished in this way. But the initial directive in this regard, regarding the punishment of fornication, is mentioned in Surah Nisa actually, and no definite punishment is mentioned there. It is only said that until some directive is revealed about women who, as prostitutes, habitually commit fornication, they should be confined to their homes, and the common perpetrators of this crime should be chastised until they repent and mend their ways. And this chastisement may range from exhorting and reprimanding, scolding and censuring, humiliating and distressing the criminal, to beating him up for the purpose of reforming him. So this initial punishment of fornication, we know, has been mentioned in Surah Nisa before this final punishment, which I just read out, being given in Surah Nur. So let us take a look at how it was mentioned earlier in Surah Nisa, in which a temporary directive was given. As I just said, that the prostitutes were, about them it was said that who habitually commit fornication, they should be confined to their homes. And about the common perpetrators of this crime, it was said that they should be chastised and given various bodily reprimands in various ways. So this is how it has been mentioned in the Quran. وَاللَّاتِي يَأْتِينَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مِن نِّسَائِكُمْ فَاسْتَشْهِدُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ أَرْبَعَةً مِّنكُمْ فَإِن شَهِدُوا فَأَمْسِكُوهُنَّ فِي الْبُيُوتِ حَتَّى يَتَوَفَّاهُنَّ الْمَوْتُ أَوْ يَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ لَهُنَّ السَّبِيلَ واللذان يأتيانها منكم فآذوهما فإن تابا وأصلحا فأعرضوا عنهما إن الله كان توابا رحيما. And upon those of your women who commit fornication, call in 4 people among yourselves to testify over them. If they testify to their ill ways, confine them to their homes till death overtakes them, or God formulates another way for them. And the man and woman guilty among you who commit fornication, chastise them. So this is the common punishment. Previously, we have seen the first part of the verse mentions prostitutes, and the second part mentions common perpetrators of this crime. About them it is said, and the man and woman among you who commit fornication, chastise them. If they repent and mend their ways, leave them alone, for God is ever forgiving and most merciful. So we can see that as far as the Quran is concerned, after this initial directive, this final directive was given in Surah Nur. Now, this punishment of fornication before the definite directive was revealed in Surah Nur, we know that this was a temporary, it was like a temporary form of reprimand. However, once this verse of Surah Nur was revealed, it actually abrogated the previous directive permanently. So remember, the previous directive was a temporary one for prostitutes and for common criminals of fornication. But this is something which overrides that directive. Now, the directives which are mentioned in these verses can be explained thus, and I'm just going to read out from Ustaz Ghamidi's Meezan so that you are also able to follow the way he has laid out this whole law. So he's written that the man or woman who have committed fornication, both shall receive 100 stripes, according to the methodology adopted by the Prophet and the rightly guided caliphs, and according to case precedents reported in our books of hadith and fiqh in this regard. Now, he has given some details about this, the nature of this punishment, the way it has been discussed and described in hadith and our books of fiqh. So, the first of them is that whether a cane is used to flog a criminal or a lash, in both cases, it should neither be very thick and hard nor very thin and soft, which of course means that it should be in a way, it should not be something which leaves a mark on the skin of the person who is to be lashed. The second important thing is that the criminal should not be beaten bare-bodied or while tied to a tripod. Now, this is something that we'll find in many Muslim countries, that they lash criminals, they flog them by tying them to a tripod, which is, of course, not what has been prescribed. And the other important thing is that he should not be beaten bare-bodied. He can wear his clothes, because this is not the purpose, as we very well know. The third important thing is that the criminal should not be flogged in a manner that wounds him, nor should he be flogged on one part of the body. The flogging should be made to spread all over the body except for his face and private parts. This again shows that this is a case of reprimand. It is not a case of cruelly injuring or wounding a person. The fourth thing which is mentioned is that a pregnant woman should be flogged only after she has given birth and the period of puerperal discharge has passed. So, if you have to flog a woman who is guilty of fornication, then this concession has to be given as well. So, this was the first thing. The second thing which Ustaz has written is that the criminal should be given this punishment publicly to humiliate him in front of the people and to make him a lesson for those present. The verse directs the government or the court of justice to show no lenience in this regard. This harsh treatment given to the criminal is essential because the stability of a society relies on the sanctity of the relationships in the family and on their protection from every type of disorder. So remember, when we were studying this punishment, the Quran has said that a group of believers, well, yashhad ta'ifa, the group of believers must witness this punishment. And that is why, about the punishment of fornication, it is essential that it should be given publicly, to not only humiliate the criminals for what they have done, and at the same time, it should act as a deterrent for all other people. When something is given publicly, it really sets up a standard, and it really is very exemplary in this regard, and it becomes extremely hard on the people who might be thinking of this violation. Thirdly, Ustaz Ghamidi writes that after this punishment has been carried out, so remember, these statutes that he is describing are not on his own, based on his own, but basically they are his interpretation of what the Quran has already said. So the first thing, that the nature of the flogging should be such that it should not wound or injure a person or make him bare-bodied, of course, something which is we can understand directly from the verses. Secondly, also, as far as the Quran is concerned, that it is the Quran itself who has directed that a group of people should witness this flogging so that it becomes a publicly known thing. And thirdly, the Quran itself has said that no chaste woman or man should marry men and women who commit fornication. So according to the Quran, such people can only marry among their own sort or among the idolaters. It does not allow the marriage of a pious man of a pious woman with a man guilty of committing fornication, nor does it permit a pious man to bring home such a woman in his house. So by this, Ustaz actually means that a person who has been publicly found guilty and punished for this crime, he becomes a declared fornicator. For such a person, he does not have the liberty for the rest of his life to marry a pious person or a pious lady. He has to marry amongst his own sort. And this is part of the punishment. So this is part of the punishment. It's not just the fact that it's a recommendation, it is part of the punishment. That if you have been declared guilty and you have been punished as a fornicator, then your marriage can not take place with a pious woman. You can only marry amongst your own sort, which means that women who have been publicly declared guilty for this crime, and similarly men who have been publicly declared guilty, of course, by the court of law, only they can marry one another, which of course, as I said, is part of the crime. And again, this is based on the Quranic words, which means وَحُرِّمَ ذَلِكَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, that such marriage is absolutely prohibited to the believers. The fourth thing which Ustaz has mentioned, I'll also mention that, and that is, while stating this punishment, adjectives are used to qualify the men and women who commit fornication. This is similar to the statement in which the punishment for theft is mentioned. It is evident, therefore, that this punishment is the utmost punishment which should be given only when the crime has been committed in its ultimate form and the criminal does not deserve any lenience as far as the circumstances of the crime are concerned. So, by this, Ustad actually means it has not been said that a person who is guilty of fornication, so the word has not been used. What has been used are actually adjectives or attributes. Azani is an adjective, and similarly, Azania is also an adjective. So, had this been not been the case, and it would have been something different, and verbs would have been used, then it would have been an entirely different matter. So this means that an attribute, something becomes an attribute of a person, it means that it becomes part of his personality. So a person can only be called a zani when fornication becomes a part of his personality. Not just one single instance of committing an act of fornication can make him a zani. So a word azani means a person who is now, he can be called by this name because it has become his habit, or it's something that you can find in him. So therefore, in this regard, we have to understand that we must not think that as far as this punishment is concerned, then this punishment cannot in any way warrant any lenience, except, as I said, if there is to be some sort of lenience to be given. And we must also understand that this punishment has been committed in its ultimate form, and only then this ultimate punishment has to be given. So what does this mean actually? It actually means that criminals who are foolish, insane, have been compelled by circumstances, are without the necessary protection required to abstain from committing a crime, or cannot bear the punishment, are all exempt from this punishment. So to give you an example, about women whom their masters would force to take to prostitution, the Quran says, and let me quote that verse, وَمَنْ يُكْرِهُنَّ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ مِنْ بَعْدِ إِكْرَاهِهِنَّ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. And if anyone compels them, Allah will be forgiving and merciful to them after their being compelled to it. Which in other words means that if women who in the times of the Prophet, they were slave women who were forced to be prostitutes, the Quran did not tell them to run away from their masters. They did not say that they have to just abstain. No, they said that this is something which they have been compelled to. So now if their masters have compelled them to this thing, then as the verse says, Inna Allaha min ba'di ikrahihinna laghafurur rahim. Because of this compulsion that they are being made to undergo, you'll find that God is very merciful to them. Let me give you another example also, which is cited by Ustaz Ghamidi in his book. He says that slave women who were present in the Prophet's times, they also cannot be administered this punishment because of their improper upbringing and education, and because of a lack of family protection. So much so, if their husbands and masters have done all they can to keep them chaste, and in spite of this they commit the crime, they shall only be given half the punishment, which means 50 lashes. So this shows that the crime of fornication that has been mentioned in the Quran is the extreme form in which a person has, he deserves no lenience. In this case, which I have just described before you, that if these slave women have been kept chaste, and in spite of that they commit fornication, then the Quran says only 50 lashes would be given to them. And for this, let me also cite the words. The Quran says, فَإِذَا أُحْسِنَّ فَإِنْ أَتَيْنَ بِفَاحِشَةٍ فَعَلَيْهِنَّ نِصْفُ مَا عَلَى الْمُحْصَنَاتِ مِنَ الْعَذَابِ. Then when they are kept chaste in this manner and they commit fornication, their punishment is half that of free women. So viewers, this brings us to an end to our discussion on the issue of fornication also, and this also would be an eye-opener for many people who would think that maybe the punishment of adultery or fornication are different, which means between married and unmarried couple. That is not so. And at the same time, you will also see that there is absolutely no need for 4 witnesses in the case of the punishment of fornication. This is something which has been erroneously inducted in the penal code. Once again, this is something which relates to erroneously accusing people of fornication. When you accuse some innocent person or a chaste person of this crime, then the Quran says that you have to bring 4 eyewitnesses. It does not say that you have to bring 4 eyewitnesses in the case of a normal case of fornication. We will discuss that, inshallah, in our next session when we will study the punishment of qazf, and it will become absolutely clear. As far as fornication is concerned, there is no stipulated a number of witnesses that have been prescribed by the Quran. It will stand proven the way crimes stand proven through DNA reports, through the testimony of the camera, or any other footage that might become available, or by the confession of the criminal, or by any other circumstantial evidence. So, inshallah, we'll take up the issue of qazf and theft, and with that, we'll be ending our chapter on Islamic punishments, and that will be, inshallah, next time. But for today, if you have any questions on what we have just studied, please raise them.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad, for an insightful discussion highlighting the important details of the topic. So we have questions. Naveed Irfan, please unmute your mic and ask your question.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू।
वालेकुम अस्सलाम।
जी, आप खैरियत से?
अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह।
जी, मेरा सवाल ये था कि ये जो सजाएं कुरान में बयान हुई हैं जिना के लिए, तो इसमें जो है फोर्सफुल जो है वो रेप के लिए, और जो है ये सेम सेक्स जो गे सेक्स है और जो लेस्बियन सेक्स है, इनके लिए स्पेशली कुछ बयान नहीं हुई है कि इन्हें भी इसी कैटेगरी में रखा जाएगा?
As far as rape is concerned, we have already discussed that. That is a punishment which is mentioned under the punishment of muharaba or fasad fil ard. And we have seen that earlier on, that muharaba and fasad fil ard have been punishable by 4 broad punishments. So one of them is taqtil, which means that you can mercilessly kill that person. You can stone him to death, for example, if he deserves no lenience. You can crucify him. You can amputate his limbs from opposite sides, and if he deserves any lenience, you can exile him. So the punishment of muharaba, or spreading anarchy in the land, which are mentioned in verse 35 or 34 of Surah Maida, they are the ones which are applicable on the issue of rape, because in rape you are guilty of spreading disorder in the land and also creating a law and order situation. As far as the punishment of homosexuality is concerned, it has not been prescribed anywhere in the Quran, and it can be legislated by a court of or by a legislative body, which is, of course, the parliament. And but the Quran itself has not prescribed any such punishment. But this does not mean that a parliament cannot do so. The parliament has the authority to legislate a punishment for homosexuality if it deems proper.
जी, इसी में कंटिन्यू कर रहा हूँ। सूरह मायदा में जो आयत में ये बयान हुआ है फसाद बिल अर्ज के लिए जो सजा बयान हुई है, वहां पर जो पीछे आयतें आ रही हैं वहां बनी इसराइल का जिक्र हो रहा है, तो वो स्पेशली जैसे यहाँ तो आयतें क्लियर हैं कि ये मुसलमानों को खिताब करके कही गई है, तो वहां से हम कैसे निकाल सकते हैं वो बात?
I mean, the way the Quran is cited that min ajli zalik, you see, min ajli zalik, it says katabna annama annahu min ajli zalik. The word, connecting word is because of this, which tells us that there is a similarity of intent, and there's a case of no revocation, no abrogation. And the way it has been mentioned, it tells us that the Quran has upheld the punishment of the Torah. So the punishment which is mentioned for the Israelites, for them, it has been upheld for the Muslims as well. You can read from the context which tells us, and the word min ajli zalik tells us that.
जी, और इसी में ही एक और सवाल ये पैदा हुआ है कि इसी में जो बनी इसराइल में ये सजा दी जाती थी, जो स्टोन से मारने की जो सजा है, तो वो वहां से यहाँ पर ली गई है। ऐसा है क्या कि जो शादीशुदा जानी के लिए ली गई है वहां से, तो ऐसा वहां तौरात में मेंशन है?
That is not correct. As I said, the Quran has clarified that this does not relate to married criminals who are married and they commit fornication. This is an additional question which the Prophet actually asks to see whether the person deserved any lenience or not. As far as this punishment of stoning is concerned, this is basically mentioned in the Quran as an interpretation of the word taqtil. Taqtil means to kill someone in a very, very merciless way. One form of that taqtil is stoning to death. There could have been other forms as well. So as far as the punishment of stoning is concerned, this is not directly mentioned in the Quran. The Quran just mentions the word taqtil. Taqtil is the real punishment.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Thank you, Naveed. If you have further questions, we may get back to you after we are done with the rest of the participants. Shiraz Ahmed, you may unmute your mic and ask your questions.
Ji, thank you. Assalamu alaikum, Shehzad bhai.
Walaikum assalam.
Shehzad bhai, as you mentioned, Quran clearly differentiates between a certain group of people whose upbringing was not as good. So the Quran already, halved their punishment. But I have heard it for the past several years or decades that now the revelation is complete and we are not going to use that divine wisdom of the Quran. So if, let's assume, a group of people who have been a non-Muslim all their lives, right? If they become Muslim today, and the next day, they commit adultery, maybe habitually. They're trying to, start following the practices of Islam, but we haven't given them enough time. So immediately we will punish them with 100 lashes, or we're going
I
to use
think immediately we will not even report that punishment. So you see, the Quran wants us to hide this punishment. We will see that in our later discussion when we discuss the punishment of qazf. The Prophet himself said that, well, if a person is innocent in character or he's trying to be good, and from him some act of some such similar act emanates, and the Quran has actually said, or the Prophet has actually said that, would that you have hidden this crime. So the way in which the Prophet has described this, and the Quran also describes it, it actually tells us that a person who is like trying to reform himself, or maybe is guilty of such one-off misconduct, then we should be hiding his misconduct instead of reporting it. It is only people who have become worthy of being reported should be reported. So the thing that we have to understand is that why should we even bring it to the notice of law when we, in our own senses, in our own discussion with that person, can maybe make sense to him and make him realize what he is doing wrong. So remember, reporting this crime itself is something which the Quran discourages.
Thank you, Shehzad bhai. I have a single-liner follow-up question, right? So let's talk about a hypothetical Muslim society who are at their worst, right? We know that they are Muslims, but they are not very religious. So when you and Javed and Ghamidi Saab teach us Quran, you say that these punishments are the maximum punishments, right? So
Right.
a judgment. So is it accurate to say that the judge may also need to take into account that, hey, we are just Muslims by birth, and maybe these people are not that well versed with Islam, and putting the maximum punishment to them is going to just push them further away from Islam, right? So that's why you say that it's a maximum punishment, that if the
Right.
person does not require any
Correct.
lenience.
Absolutely, you're right about that. So a person who has maybe just started to practice Islam, or maybe, as you said, have just converted and still not fully, fully conversant with the rules of Islam. So all these things will be taken into account by the judge. And this is something which he will only administer to a person who is fully aware of what he has done, and he deserves no lenience. I mean, this is the guideline that shall be given to the judge, that when you see that a person who is doing it willfully, knowingly, out of having full protection, still swaying from righteousness when he knew that he could have abstained from that path. So you see, all these things will be taken into consideration by the judge, and this guideline will be given to him that unless and until you find that there is absolutely no circumstantial evidence, or there's nothing that could give them any lenience, should you prescribe these punishments. Otherwise, he can prescribe any other punishment which is lesser in form. For example, he can penalize them, he can have them, even let's say lash with a very small number of lashes, like 5 or 6 or 7 if he deems fit. He can impose a penalty on them. So all these lesser forms of punishment, if he deems fit, can be given, and he can even make them go free or scot-free if they think that they are still not in the frame of mind, or they have not been fully educated, and they should not be given any punishment. So as I said, it is all situational, and this is what the Quran teaches us. And this also is not just a simple matter of deduction. It is basically a linguistic matter. The way the word azani is used, it's like an adjective. Had it been allazi zana or allati tazna, that would have been how a verb is normally used, which would mean that a person who commits a fornication once or twice. So verbs are always used when a person does something once or twice, or it's not becomes a habit of him. But an attribute is only used when it becomes the person's habit. So the word azani has been used just as the word asariq has been used for a person who is a thief. So linguistically also, we have to understand that this punishment cannot be administered until and unless that criminal deserves absolutely no lenience.
Thank you very much, Jazakallah.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. There's a question in the chat. You speak about death among Muslims. What about the situations in which either the murder or the the one who is murdered is a non-Muslim?
So as I said, in that case, this law that we have studied today, and the rest of it that we'll study inshallah next week, it relates to a Muslim per se. As far as the punishments of non-Muslims are concerned, if they are guilty of murder or theft or fornication or qazf, this says something in which a parliament can legislate and take their opinion, and then form, and then give any form of punishment, which as a result takes into consideration their viewpoint. So these punishments which we have discussed today, they unilaterally concern only Muslims who have entered the covenant with God of becoming Muslims. For others, it has to be legislated.
Right, thank you. So there's a question that I have, and that is that in in our society and in the world, fornication or having consensual physical intimacy is very common, and it's not even considered wrong.
Right.
So, but in Islam, we are encouraged. I've learned many times from you and Javed and Ghamidi too, that we are supposed to not tell the world about whatever people's sins or whatever wrongdoings they're doing, right? So what would be a scenario in which a person's this act would go so far that will go to the court,
Right.
and then there'll be a judgment done based on it? So what is it?
You see, I understand. So you see, when a person becomes a nuisance in the society, what he or the both of them are doing, it affects the family in any way. It becomes rampant, and people are getting affected by it. The impact is very deep. Then, of course, people can decide. And remember that in such a case, also, the Quran says that if you have to accuse someone of this, then you have to bring 4 eyewitnesses. Otherwise, what except self-confession would be the way in which a person will go and confess that. There would be no other way for the crime of fornication to be reported. So basically, if you have to report someone, then it has to be on the basis of an accusation. And then in that accusation, you must see people doing that crime as an eyewitness, which itself shows, because it's not going to happen very easily, or maybe it would be a very rare situation, that actually Islam discourages this to happen. It does not want this to happen, unless, of course, things go as far as the person becomes such a nuisance that he does such acts so openly that there are 4 eyewitnesses available to witness what he's doing. This itself shows that such should be the extent of the nature of his carelessness and indifference to Islamic law.
So even though Allah has told us in the Quran that this is one of the biggest sins, He still wants us to.
He still wants people to reform, because you see, look at the punishment.
Wants us to hide. Yes.
Yeah, that's it. You see, the punishment is that once you are a convict, you have been convicted of fornication, your own marriage would break. You would no longer be married with the pious woman that you were married if you were married. And if you are to marry, then you will only marry amongst women or men who are similarly guilty of fornication, and they have been convicted for that. So you see, this is because the reputation is going to suffer for the rest of the life. You will become a non-entity for the rest of your life, so to speak. So that is why the Quran says that it has laid very stringent rules to convict a person for this crime. It actually wants people to reform themselves, realize themselves that they are doing something wrong. It wants elders of the society to interfere and tell them and educate them that this is something which is going to go worse. It would be adverse to their own family. It would be something which is absolutely killing for their children as well. So basically, it's that realization which the Quran wants that should happen. But if things get out of control, obviously this is something which every person can do. But before that happens, The Quranic directive is that this should be done only when a person has become so lecherous and so lustful that he does this in such a careless way, in indifferent way, that you can find four witnesses doing this, witnessing him, and you are able to accuse him of fornication, because you see, no one is going to do this in front of the society. It's only when a person becomes so lecherous that he does not care, he is going to do it inside of his home or outside. Does he do this crime in a way that you have four eyewitnesses for him?
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Shiraz Ahmed, please ask your question.
Shehzad bhai, this question is directly related to somebody who's very close to me in my personal life, right? A friend. He only has one daughter and three sons, and I consider her my daughter, not just niece. So a few months back, he got engaged to somebody, and they are filthy rich people. I'm not going to name them, but then they got proof that while that boy was in UK, let's just say his past was not very clean. I am talking in the context of fornication, right? Now, they called me to their home yesterday and they were discussing the scenario with me. What shall parents do in such a situation? Because the cross argument is that, hey, a girl can never be sure about any guy. Any guy can have a change of heart in the future, right? So, yeah, the risk is always there. But in this particular situation, what shall they be? If you were the parent of if you were the father of that girl, what would be your advice to that girl? Because at the end of the day, it's her decision.
So you see, it's difficult to give an advice without complete data. But personally, I think I would leave the decision to my daughter, and I would tell her that, well, if the person has clearly repented and he has come out of his evil habits, and he's otherwise a good person, and he's willing to settle as a family person. He's not going to have those extramarital relations anymore. So to give that person a fair chance. But as I said, this is something that can be just an advice from the father. It's maybe the girl herself would not like to continue with such a person. That's her personal choice. So as an advice, of course, we would say that once this has happened and the person has come clean and he has totally given up, so maybe he should be given that chance. That would be, I think, an advice that most fathers would give. But finally, it's the will of the daughter that should prevail.
Sabnam, please go ahead.
ओके थैंक यू सर मुझे पूछना था कि आपने भी बताया गामदी साहब डिस्करेज करते हैं जेल कैद करने की प्रिजन की पनिशमेंट को तो सर व्हाट आर बाकी जो पनिशमेंट्स प्रेस्क्राइब की गई हैं वो एक्सट्रीम फॉर्म्स हैं तो वो क्योंकि सर एग्जाइल तो आजकल एक डिजायरेबल चीज है लोगों के लिए तो सर व्हाट काइंड ऑफ अदर पनिशमेंट्स कैन बी लेजिस्लेटेड फॉर माइनर क्राइम्स
Other punishments, of course, the biggest is penalty. You can impose some penalty, monetary penalty. You can give some physical penalty. You can flog a person, maybe 10, 5, 7 lashes, depending on the nature of the crime. You can ask him to do some physical thing which is difficult for him to accomplish. You can give him some errands. So these are the things that we generally do.
Thank you, sir. Right, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. There is a question from Sania. The fornicator should marry a fornicator or an idolater. What about a Muslim woman fornicator? Can she marry an idolater? Referring to Surah Nur, Ayah 3.
Yeah, so that is what the Quran has actually said, that such is the heinous nature of this crime that once a person has been declared a convict, he can either marry amongst his own sort, or he or she can marry amongst idolaters, which are people who, of course, commit polytheism. So, in other words, polytheism and fornication, they are brought at par, because you see, when you commit fornication, you are disloyal to your spouse. And when you commit polytheism, you are disloyal to God. So this is how the Quran wants to express the extent of this disloyalty. In the one case, you are being disloyal to your spouse, and in the other case, you are being disloyal to God. And that is why the Quran has said that in such a case, either you marry amongst your own, exactly people who have done what you have done, or people who are guilty of idolatry.
So, in other words, a convicted fornicator does not matter to Allah if he remains a Muslim or not?
No, that's not the case. I mean, that is part of his punishment. So when he is going to marry a polytheist person, that's not going to turn him into a non-Muslim.
Yeah.
He still remains a Muslim. The only thing is that this is his punishment, that he cannot marry a pious person in the society. He cannot marry someone who is introduced as a Muslim in the society. He can only marry a person who is similarly guilty of the crime that he or she has committed, or someone who is an idolatress or an idolater.
Thank you. Shiraz, if you still want to ask your question.
Oh, thank you. Shehzad bhai, today's verse of the Quran about accidental death explicitly talk about a Muslim accidentally killing another Muslim. What about if a Muslim accidentally kills a non-Muslim, right? An accident happened, the other person can be an atheist. In that
Right.
case, are we supposed to do ijtihad, means the parliament
Of course, yes.
will do some...
I've just described that all these punishments which are mentioned in the Quran, they are meant specifically for Muslims. Any non-Muslim guilty of perpetrating the same crime, in that case, a legislation has to be done by the parliament. And of course, the opinion of those people who are non-Muslims will be taken, and then the parliament will legislate. So in such a case, it's maybe the non-Muslims, they adopt the same punishment as the Quran has prescribed. Maybe they opt for the same punishment, and maybe they don't. But the final decision will be with the parliament. But the consent of these non-Muslims shall be taken when this law is being formed. But what is absolutely certain is that these 5 punishments have been specifically prescribed for Muslims. For non-Muslims, it shall be a new legislation done with their consent.
And same is true.
Thank you.
You already said it, so sorry, but same is true for fornication as well, right? So if a Muslim and a
Yes,
non-Muslim
yes,
commits a
yes,
fornication,
all five, whether it's theft, whether it's fornication, whether it's qazf, whether it's murder, and whether it's haraba.
Thank you, Shiraz. Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Naveed, you may ask your question.
जी डॉक्टर साहब मैं जानना चाह रहा था कि अभी आपने बताया था लेकिन मैं क्लियर नहीं हो पाया कि कोई शादीशुदा मर्द या औरत अगर जिना के मुर्तकिब हो जाते हैं तो उनका रिश्ता बाकी रहेगा कि खत्म हो जाएगा?
I mean, either of them or both of them?
Either of them.
I mean, what I'm saying is, if they are not convicted, if their matter has not been taken to the court and the court has not convicted them, their marriage will still stay intact. And as I said, in that case, the Quran wants us to hide the punishment or the crime of such a person. Their marriage will only break when they are convicted of this punishment by a court of law.
Inshallah, we will see each other tomorrow. And thank you everyone for participating. Allah.